When we covered perfect competition, we learned that the outcome of the perfectly competitive market is efficient if there are no externalities like pollution. The economic surplus, or in other words, the gains from trade between consumers and producers, is maximized in perfect competition. This socially beneficial result happens in a competitive market because the price conveys good information and gives producers and consumers incentives to act in socially beneficial ways. In a competitive market, price equals marginal cost. It also equals the minimum of long-run average cost. These costs are economic costs, or in other words, opportunity cost. Since price equals marginal cost, the price reflects the opportunity cost of producing the product. Producers will produce the product and consumers will consume the product as long as this improves society's welfare more than producing something else with the scarce resources used in the production process. In this diagram, the monopolist's output is labeled QM, and the price it charges is PM. The monopolist chooses its output to maximize profit, which is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Here, P does not equal marginal cost, so the outcome will not be efficient. The point where price equals marginal cost is where the marginal cost curve intersects the demand curve. This would be the outcome if the market was perfectly competitive. This point is labeled PC and QC. Now let's compare the economic welfare under perfect competition and single price monopoly. First, what is the consumer surplus under perfect competition? Consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the price, which in this case is PC. So under perfect competition, the consumer surplus is A plus B plus C plus D plus E. Now what is the consumer surplus under monopoly? Once again, it is the area below the demand curve and above the price. Now the price is PM. So consumer surplus is A plus B. What is producer surplus under competition? Producer surplus is the area below the price and above the marginal cost curve. When the market is competitive, this is F plus G plus H. What is producer surplus under monopoly? The monopolist captures C plus D plus F plus G as producer surplus. When the single price monopolist maximizes profit, it produces less output and charges a higher price. Compared to the outcome in the competitive market, the monopolist transfers C plus D from consumers to itself as producer surplus. What is the deadweight loss from monopoly? With monopoly, E and H are no longer part of the economic surplus. So E and H represent the deadweight loss or social cost to monopoly. This represents the loss in gains from trade from there being less exchanges than under competition. If trade expanded from QM to QC, there would be gains from trade because consumers' willingness to pay, as represented by the demand curve, is greater than the opportunity cost of production, as represented by the marginal cost curve. This diagram depicts a natural monopoly. Minimum efficient scale is relatively large compared to market demand. One firm is able to produce enough to meet market demand at a lower per unit price than multiple firms could. Public utilities that provide natural gas or electricity are examples of natural monopolies. Generally, public utilities are regulated by state governments. Regulators have a couple of options in how they require the natural monopoly to set price. One option would be to force the monopolist to set price equal to marginal cost, which is represented here by PC. Setting the price to be equal to marginal cost is tempting since this is efficient. However, the problem is that for the natural monopolist, PC is less than average cost, which means that economic profit would be negative. If the regulator required the monopolist to charge PC, the monopolist would not be covering its opportunity cost. The labor, capital, and other economic resources could be more profitably employed elsewhere. So if the regulator forces the monopolist to charge PC, the monopolist will choose to go out of business. A more sustainable choice is to require the monopolist to set price equal to average cost, so that its long-run economic profit will be zero. This is P fair in the diagram. At this price, the monopolist is doing just as well as its next best alternative. It is earning a normal rate of return. There are a number of possible problems with regulating a monopolist. One is information. How do regulators know what the monopolist's actual costs are? Closely related to the information problem are some problems of incentives. X inefficiency refers to a situation where a firm lacks incentive to control its costs. If the regulator is going to require the monopolist to set price equal to average cost, what incentive does the monopolist have to keep costs down? The monopolist can game the system by allowing its costs to go up. No need to work hard, time for nice company vehicles, a better office, company paid lunches, or more company parties. Another incentive issue is regulatory capture. This is where the regulatory agency is dominated by the industry they are supposed to regulate. It only makes sense that the state agency regulating the natural gas producers hires people with years of experience in the natural gas industry. However, this creates close connections between the two. Even more importantly, if you learned that state regulators and the natural gas industry were getting cozy, what would you do about it? Suppose as a consumer of natural gas, you learn that regulators are not doing a good job. They are in bed with the industry, and so your natural gas prices are too high. Are you going to write letters to your representatives in Congress? Are you going to travel to the Capitol, take your representative out to eat, give her a cash contribution, and ask her to reform regulation and hold regulators accountable? Of course not. And if you did do these things, you would have a hard time convincing enough other natural gas consumers to join you to make a difference. What you can count on is that the natural gas monopoly is writing letters, taking representatives out to eat, giving cash contributions, and doing a number of other things necessary to influence public policymakers and the regulators. This is because the benefits of the policy is concentrated into the hands of the few, in this case the natural gas company, while the costs are spread out over millions of natural gas consumers. Even though the costs of inefficient policy outweigh the benefits, it is much easier for the natural gas company to organize to influence policymakers and regulators than the millions of consumers. For decades, regulation in the telephone industry protected Ma Bell from competition and stifled technological change. Service was poor, the operators that consumers had to deal with when making long-distance calls were rude, and rates were high. The regulators had been captured by Ma Bell so that they no longer effectively protected the public's interests. In the competitive era of today, technological change is constant and costs continue to decrease as quality improves. Similarly, the age of heavy regulation in the airline industry was a time of high prices and low competition. The regulators protected the dominant carrier, Pan Am, from competition. Rather than keeping prices low, the regulators prevented other carriers from competing with Pan Am on price or through innovation. When the commercial airline industry was deregulated and opened up to competition, Pan Am went out of business. There are certain benefits from monopoly. Microsoft is an example of some of these. For one, Microsoft is able to realize significant cost advantages through economies of scale. Recall that as long as marginal cost is less than average cost decreases as more is produced. Creating an operating system and other types of software requires many hours of programming, which is very expensive. On the other hand, the marginal cost or additional cost of making its software available for download to another user is very low, practically zero. Since the marginal cost is so low, as more and more is produced, the per unit cost or average cost decreases. Thus, the cost advantages of economies of scale that are realized through having a long run of production make it so that for a particular type of software, there will often be just one firm in the industry. Another reason why there may be cost advantages to having just one firm in the market is economies of scope. Economies of scope exist when there are cost advantages to having multiple products produced within one company. In the late 1990s, when Microsoft got in trouble with the Justice Department for anti-competitive practices, one solution that was discussed was breaking Microsoft into multiple companies, each producing a different product. However, arguably, consumers could not be better served if they purchased their Windows operating system from one company, their word processor from another company, and their Excel spreadsheet from yet another company. There are cost advantages to producing the operating system and the bundle of Office software within one firm, where the design teams can collaborate and work together, and where other tasks like advertising and marketing and general management can be shared across the products. Another reason why Microsoft came to dominate the market in the 90s and the early 2000s is demand-side increasing returns, or network externalities. This is an issue for both the operating system and its Office software like Word and Excel. Consider first the demand-side increasing returns associated with its operating system. Firms designing software wanted to write software that would run on the operating system that most of its potential customers had. Consumers wanted to own the operating system that most of the software that they might want to use was designed to work on. So once Microsoft got the edge as the most popular operating system, it was able to take almost the entire market. Software developers designed their software to work primarily with the Microsoft Windows operating system. Since all of the software was written for Windows, consumers almost always purchased Microsoft Windows. You can see that if you developed a new, even superior operating system, it would be very difficult to sell a single copy because there was no software yet developed to run on your new operating system. And software developers would not want to design their software to run on your operating system because no consumers were yet buying the new operating system. A similar issue of demand-side increasing returns existed for Word. In the 90s, if you wanted to share a file with someone else, they needed to have the software that was compatible with that file. So to share a Word file, other people needed to have Microsoft Word. This created a significant benefit to having the same type of software as other people. Or in other words, there was demand-side increasing returns in word processing software. The demand-side increasing returns created a significant barrier to entry, preventing new word processing software from being developed. The demand-side increasing returns made it so that it seemed that Microsoft may dominate the market forever. How was any other company ever going to be able to compete? Profits were incredibly high. However, the demand-side increasing returns, economies of scale and economies of scope, made it seem like it was impossible for any other company ever to be able to compete with Microsoft. The key to Microsoft ever losing its market dominance lies in technological change. An entrepreneur wanting a piece of Microsoft's extraordinary profits was not going to be able to do it by trying to do what Microsoft was already doing, even if she could do it better. The entrepreneur needed to come up with new, disruptive technology. Thus, the monopoly profits that Microsoft enjoyed would create an incentive for other companies to come up with new technology. Monopoly profits may induce significant innovation as companies try to overcome the barriers to entry and compete. When policymakers were concerned about Microsoft, nobody had imagined that Google would come up with a way to provide word processing software and spreadsheet software for free. Nor had they imagined the innovations that Apple would pursue, including the iPhone. In the world of smartphones and the cloud, Microsoft has had to scramble to keep up. It may have been the high profits that inspired some of the technological innovation behind Google and the smartphone and Apple. Certainly, the technological change has mitigated the concern that Microsoft is a monopoly. Demand-side increasing returns is a key reason why some of the so-called tech giants like YouTube, Google, and Facebook face so little competition today. Concerns have been raised over their incredible power to influence public opinion through censorship, manipulating search results, or through demonetizing some content creators. For instance, they may favor some political views over others. This has led to calls to regulate them. However, there are a couple of reasons why we want to be cautious when considering regulation. For one, the theory of regulatory capture. What makes us so confident that regulators will act in the public's interests? In reality, the tech giants will have a strong incentive to influence regulators, while the general public has no incentive to be as informed and engaged in the political process as the tech giants. Experience in economic theory suggests that it is the tech giants that will steer the public policy and regulators, not the general public. For this reason, the tech giants may actually welcome regulation. The regulation could make it even more difficult for new companies with new technology to ever be able to get in and compete with them. This was the result of the regulation in the airline industry and the telephone industry for many decades. It actually prevented competition and the disruptive technological change that would accompany the new competition.